Hello and welcome. I'm Eileen Fuchs, the new President and Executive Director of the National Building Museum. I am thrilled to virtually greet all of you and welcome you to the continuation of an important new program series focused on climate action. We are fortunate to be co-hosting this series with our 2021 Honor Award honoree global design firm, Skidmore, Owings Merrill. In fact, inspired by SOM, we've transformed our annual award event into a months-long call to climate action, which includes this series, as well as a dynamic virtual event on June 17th. So mark your calendar. We hope you'll join us and New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, and Massachusetts Senator Edward Markey, co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, and be inspired to be part of this critical conversation. The National Building Museum tells stories and inspires curiosity about our built world, the places where we live and work and play. By doing so, we create new ways in which people interact with the world around them. Our past storytelling in the climate change space includes the 2003 exhibition Big and Green Towards Sustainable Architecture in the 21st Century, our Smart Growth series, and our For the Greener Good series. That we have shifted our language about environmental topics from green to climate change since that exhibition shows just how urgent and critical things have become. In this past year, we also formalized a new program series, Equity in the Built Environment. This series covers topics like restorative justice and improving racial equity through greener design. In tonight's program, these critical and intertwined issues of climate justice and social equity come together for thought-provoking discussion. These issues are at the core of what the National Building Museum is presenting within our spaces, discussing within our communities, and exploring in our own institutional practices and research priorities. Tonight, and over the course of this series, and with SOM at our side, we continue to explore the role that architecture and the building industry must play in addressing the global climate crisis, which in and of itself perpetuates inequality. Before we get to the heart of the program, in addition to the panelists, I want to thank and recognize Amazon as the NBM Climate Action Series and Honor Award Presenting Plus sponsor, DPR Construction as our keynote sponsor, and Clark Construction as our steward sponsor. If you enjoy what you see in this program, please do consider becoming a museum member, which will get you access to the rest of this series and the June 17th Honor Award event for free. In addition, you will receive early access and discounts to other programs and events and discounts at our award-winning museum shop. And if you're already a member, thank you so much for your support. And now it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator, Dawveed Scully. As an associate director and senior urban designer at SOM, Dawveed Scully spearheads complex urban planning projects at the neighborhood, district, and city scale through an equitable design lens. He has helped lead SOM's approach to community engagement, refining the firm's strategies for better engaging and championing communities they serve. Please welcome Dawveed Scully.
All right, thank you, Eileen. Really excited to be here, everybody. Really excited to be here. Excited and hello and good evening. As Elaine mentioned, my name is Dawveed Scully. I'm an associate director at SOM City Design Practice. And I'm excited to welcome you guys to this second of 4 panels. This one really focusing on climate action and social justice. And I would like to start this with a land acknowledgement, coming from I'm coming to you from the traditionally unceded homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. I think it's better known to folks as Chicago. But many other tribes, such as the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Sac, the Fox, called this area home. And the region has long been a place for indigenous groups to gather and maintain kinship ties. And today it has one of the largest groups of indigenous population here in the United States. And I'm giving this land acknowledgement really to, not just acknowledge the, sort of the past, but to understand the importance of understanding our collective past and moving forward into the future to radically reimagine and create, better and more sustainable systems. So a little bit, sort of about the major issues of climate change and something that we know is a global issue that continues to impact all of us. But the evidence is also clear that there is disproportionate impact on, sort of poor and disinvested communities all over the world. And that there's a real need to both look at social equity and the importance of equity in the equation when we're addressing and understanding climate justice and climate action, and the need for really understanding and having a real impact on the issues of all of these communities together collectively. And we understand that these are issues globally: sea level rise, looking at heat events, looking at sort of extreme weather events that have been happening all over. Just during the pandemic, understanding the wildfires that happened in San Francisco and in Australia, the water and sort of weather events that have been happening all over, large scale flooding and urban flooding in areas all over sort of the country and the world, that there's a real need to understand and address these issues, but also sort of really have an impact from a larger scale perspective. And one of the key stats that really is powerful is the World Health Organization estimates that between 2030 and 2050, every year, due to climate action, an additional 250,000 people will die, sort of because of these issues. So we really need to act now. And, this is really both a call to action, but, a way to find each other, and we need to work together to solve these key issues. One of the things that we've also known is that, the COVID-19 pandemic really brought to light a lot of these issues and saw the overlap of the things that have been happening in a lot of these communities all over. And this is an illustration of the Bay Area, where you see the areas that have been most impacted with COVID-19 are also overlapped significantly with poor areas. And that is due to many factors around, sort of where folks are able to live and able to afford to live, and how that impacts the overall health and wellness and life expectancy of people all over. And a study was recently done here in Chicago that looked at a 30-year life difference between neighborhoods, between Streeterville and Inglewood, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood on the South Side. So there's a lot of real issues that we really want to tackle and need to tackle, looking at a holistic, equitable approach. And, sort of that whole idea of really trying to understand that these are all interrelated issues, that we can't look at them in silos, that health and wellness, that climate action, that economy and jobs are all interrelated, and the overall health and wellness and the issues of equity are at the intersection of all of those. And we really want to understand and continue to evolve and create better places. And the way to do that is really through building relationships, through authentic collaboration and thought leadership, in conversations like we're going to have tonight with amazing people who are on the ground doing this work. And one quote that really comes to mind, a principle from Bruce Miles' 24 Principles for Massive Change, is really this idea that new wicked problems demand new wicked teams. And, in that fashion, we put together an amazing panel to really start to talk and have a dialogue around those issues today. And I'll give a really quick just intro, and then I'll let the panelists themselves tell you a little bit about themselves and tell you a little bit about the work they're doing and what they're passionate about. But we're really excited to have Diane Jones Allen, FAIA, professor and program director at the College of Architecture and Planning and Public Affairs at UT Arlington, and principal of Design Jones. We have Joyce Coffee, who's founder and president of Climate Resilience Consultancy. We have Ifeoma Ebo, who's founding director of Creative Urban Alchemy, LLC. And Arathi Gowda, who's a co-worker of mine and co-teacher together, where we both work at SOM, and she's leading our high performance design group here in Chicago. And last but definitely not least, Tatum Lau, who's a senior associate and resilience planner for AECOM out of Dallas. So excited to have this amazing group of folks here. And I want to really kick it off with Ifeoma to talk a little bit about the work that she's been doing. So Ifeoma, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dawveed, and thank you to the National Building Museum and SOM for the honor to be a part of this really interesting discussion and panel. Again, my name is Ifeoma Ebo. I'm founding director of Creative Urban Alchemy, as well as an adjunct professor at Syracuse Architecture and Columbia GSAP, and one of the founding members of the Black Space Urbanist Collective, a national network of Black practitioners striving for equity and justice in the built environment. So climate change is a threat to everyone's physical health, mental health, air, water, food, and shelter, but some groups, socially and economically disadvantaged ones, face the greatest risk. This is because of where they live, their health, income, language barriers, and limited access to resources. In the United States, these more vulnerable communities are largely the communities of color, immigrants, low-income communities. As time goes on, they will suffer the worst impacts of climate change, unless we recognize that fighting climate change and environmental justice are inextricably linked. To put this topic in historical context, in the US, for investment in real estate, the US government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which provided banks with a map showing which areas were high risk and should be avoided, and which areas were low risk and ideal for investment. In cities across the country, in which this redlining policy denied federally backed mortgages and credit to minority neighborhoods. As a result, African Americans had limited access to better homes and all the advantages that went with them: a healthy environment, better schools and healthcare, and more food options. As a result, whiter and already more affluent neighborhoods were given more generous loans, as well as more preferential development treatment. Next slide. As a result, redline areas are poor, polluted, and industrial, while the more favorable treated white neighborhoods are thriving with intergenerational wealth. In addition to this income inequality on formerly redlined communities today, the impacts of poor infrastructure, development, pollution, and other associated consequences have only continued to impact the livelihoods of people living in redlined areas. The environmental impacts of segregation are certainly intersectional. In conjunction with the fact that those who lived in redline communities are consistently poorer than those who do not, it becomes increasingly evident that climate change exacerbates existing socioeconomic problems in these areas. In those areas, as a result of marginalization, redline communities have experienced a long list of consistent stresses and hardships, eroding the socioeconomic fabric of those communities, leaving them vulnerable to the shocks of climate change that, when occur, have devastating impacts, as is evidenced by the pandemic. Most of the communities hardest hit by COVID across the country are formerly redlined neighborhoods. Next slide. I want to offer one resource for practitioners striving for climate and environmental justice, particularly in Black communities. The Black Space Urbanist Collective is a nonprofit and national network of Black creatives, and we created the Black Space Manifesto to support practitioners working in, with, and for Black communities. It is a set of 14 guiding principles that acknowledges the way we work is critical. Acknowledging past oppressions, triumphs, future aspirations, and challenges, this manifesto pushes people to co-create a future where Black people, Black spaces, and Black culture matter and thrive. Reckon with the past and cultivate wealth, which really centers acknowledging the past so that we are not destined to repeat it, as we strive to create new futures where Black communities reap the benefits of a restored wealth of time, talent, and treasure. I'm looking forward to expanding on this further in discussion. I neglected to mention that I am zooming in from Lenape and Canarsie land, also known as Brooklyn, New York. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone. I'm Arathi Gowda, an Associate Director for SOM's High Performance Design Group. And I'm so happy to be here with you talking with the panelists for this important discussion on the intersection of justice and climate change. Like my colleague Dawveed, I'm in Chicago, so I'll acknowledge the land where I grew up and helped raise me, I would say, Pittsburgh. So the indigenous populations of Pittsburgh are the Shawnee and the Osage people, so I want to thank them. At SOM, I've been very lucky to work on projects across the globe in more than 35 cities with varied cultures and climates. So for those of you in the audience who may be unfamiliar with our work, as a collective practice, we're known for tall and complex projects and also large-scale master plans. As a sustainability specialist, my work has been focused on whole life carbon reduction, resource efficiency, and regenerative design for the clients and communities that we work with. And in practice, we see that there are a lot of weighty questions that take quite a long time to unfurl. So like many of the other panelists, I'm also an educator, and I've worked at multiple universities with coursework focused on climate and social impact. But in large part, my interest in teaching is that it's a vehicle to explore questions that we want to answer in practice. So I started teaching 9 years ago because we passed 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That was really the impetus for me to start teaching. And I think we all understand that that's well beyond the safe threshold of 350 parts per million. So my first teaching gig was at Foundation University, where my students designed and built a community center for victims of Typhoon Sendong. Of course, we're seeing storm intensities increase, and this was a direct impact from climate change. They also built a marine sanctuary for local fishermen of Dumaguete in the Philippines. Really wonderful work, and they have a bamboo workshop there. At Roosevelt University, I teach students who are going after their Master's of Business in Real Estate, and those students really explore questions around affordable housing, employment, and gentrification. The purpose of this is really to have them propose alternate financing mechanisms for the buildings that they're designing. So this is in a course called Sustainable Urbanism in the Just Cities. Again, this is a problem that we often see in practice, that the financing perhaps is not there for the sustainable initiatives we have. So to Dawveed's point, how do we build a bigger sandbox and invite our partners in the building industry to also participate in really sustainable outcomes? Next. At IIT, which is a more traditional design school, I've taught a series of design studios that explore infrastructure's ability to have a positive economic impact on people and places. So the studio that you're seeing on the left, called the Mobility Plus Studio, really looked at how emissions per vehicle mile of various modes of transportation could influence design solutions. And this was done almost 10 years ago. Very interesting to see design students calculate carbon emissions at that point. The studio that you're seeing on the left, as Dawveed had alluded to, we're teaching together a really fun class called the Green Line New Deal Studio. Again, obviously the name is inspired by the omnibus legislation that we're all looking to see passed. And this is focused on the 63rd Street corridor of Englewood in Chicago. And the students' designs really have an inspiration that's focused on green jobs, community activation, youth empowerment, food equity, affordable housing, and adaptive reuse. Wonderful work, and the future looks very bright when we see it from the perspective of our students. Next. I also find inspiration from civic engagement, like many of the panelists that you'll see today. So it's in these venues, just like we're seeing today, that we're able to explore ideas that are at the forefront of professional practice. And we think about our collective bargaining power. SOM has large collective bargaining power, but there are larger circles of influence still. So in the last year, I've been taking a deep dive as a steering committee member of the U.S. Architects Declare. And this particular organization recognizes the urgency of the interconnected climate justice and biodiversity crisis, just as we're discussing tonight. All of this requires immediate transformation in the way we practice, teach, build, and talk to each other. So with that, I'll pass it over to our next panelist.
Thank you so much, Arathi. This is Joyce Coffee, and I am the president and founder of Climate Resilience Consulting, which is a social enterprise, also based in Chicago. And Dawveed did a beautiful job of acknowledging our Indigenous history in Chicago. I also wanted to mention that in Chicago, our first non-Indigenous American settler was Jean-Baptiste du Sable, a free man of African descent. So please do consider that as you tarry across the Michigan Avenue Chicago Bridge. Next slide. So our practice is informed by the fact that climate change is not fair, and it is creating a bigger and bigger tale of two Americas, that of white privilege, like me, and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, and lower income people. And there's some pretty amazing data out there. I'm going to talk to you about some of the big picture data, and then perhaps we'll get into a little bit more of the finer scale around my city. So climate change is expected to drive significant economic damage, especially in lower income counties. They are expected to have a much higher rate of decreasing their GDP based upon agriculture, mortality, crime, labor productivity, coastal impacts, and energy demand, all driven by climate change impacts. So on the top left image here, you see that counties in green are actually expected to gain in their GDP, according to these data from 2017, while counties in red are expected to suffer. But let's get a little bit closer here and look at the map in the lower left-hand corner. This shows that currently, with our tax dollars, after extreme events, when there is disaster recovery money flowing into communities, Black residents on average lose wealth and white residents gain wealth. In fact, in data from Dr. Junea Howell, between 1990 and 2013, a white household who sustained a natural disaster was actually receiving over $200,000 in growing wealth after that disaster, while a Black household was receiving $125,000 less. They were becoming poorer post-disaster based upon our tax-based driven flood and fire and hurricane disaster recovery monies. And you can see that this is true for many of our big cities, that in fact, the increase in white-Black wealth is growing, especially due to natural disasters, including in many of the cities where you are all sitting today. So on to the next slide. But what does this mean when we get even more local? Well, when you look at pretty much any city's map and you ask for information about flooding or heat, and you compare those data to poverty, you see an astounding correlation. And what these data also mean is that BIPOC Americans are dying more due to climate risk. You may know that Chicago sustained a really textbook extreme heat event in the 1990s, and we lost 750 or so souls. And of that, over 90% of those individuals were BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Also, these families have been suffering from water and basement for decades. So taking it away from Chicago for just a moment, I'm the chair of the board, or the incoming chair of the board, for the Anthropocene Alliance, which is the nation's largest collective of flood survivors. And what we find in our work is an incredible emphasis on the impact to Black residents. In particular, we're seeing great rises in inequality in coastal Black neighborhoods that are flooding more and more. So last slide. As part of a Kresge Foundation funded project, we asked over 250 local government officials, are you working on climate change risk mitigation? And are you working on social equity? And most especially, do these two things intersect? And what we found was that, well, the majority of local government officials are keen to do more about social equity. And by the way, these data were taken in 2020 in a survey that was nationwide. Many, many fewer of them are doing something about it. And only 25% of them are actually successfully, according to their own measures, addressing social equity and climate resilience. So we have a long way to go in order to create that future that we all know we need, of a less segregated and more fair and more equitable America, even as climate change makes things so much harder for our Black and Hispanic and Indigenous and new immigrant Americans. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dawveed, and thanks to the National Building Museum for having me. I feel very honored to sit on this virtual space, or this virtual bench with such an esteemed panel. So as Dawveed said, my name is Tatum Lau. I'm a senior associate at AICOM out of the West region, which covers everything from Minneapolis and Texas to the West Coast. and I'm an urban planner and designer by training. Our studio focuses on integrated planning across all scales at the intersection of climate action, resilience, equity, mobility, land use, and economics. Most recently, my team supported the city of Dallas on their first comprehensive climate and environmental action plan, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But first, I wanted to let you know that I'm from South Africa, but joining you here today from what's known as Dallas, Texas, which is also the ancestral home of many indigenous peoples, including the Caddo, Wichita, Tawakoni, Kickapoo, as well as tribes that have lived here, including the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache, and those indigenous peoples whose names we do not know. I'd like to honor and respect those who were and continue to be stewards of this land. So like many others, I'd just like to start with making the case for why moving the needle on climate change requires addressing racial disparities and injustices. Well, a CDC study found that in the US, Black children are twice as likely as white children to have asthma, and with greater severity. So that means experiencing higher than average rates of hospitalization, emergency room visits, and deaths from asthma. Researchers have long understood the link between asthma and exposure to air pollution. And so if anyone, at the risk of anyone assuming that Black children perhaps are more predisposed to asthma, I think a better way to phrase that finding is really Black children are much more likely to be exposed to air pollution. But that also means that someone made the decision to locate highways, industrial plants, or other sources of pollution near this community. So if you look at the maps, how does this play out in Dallas, Texas? The darker blue on the left shows census blocks with larger shares of people of color in the southern and western parts of the city. And in the very same neighborhoods on the right, you see the number of pediatric asthma cases. My team at AICOM supported the city of Dallas, as I said, and we looked at all sorts of different characteristics related to public health and climate change. And when you look at access to food, flood risk, tree canopy, in almost every one of these areas, we see similar disparities based on race and income. So one of my questions are is if planning and policy got us here, then we've got to be proactive about planning and policy needing to undo and remedy these harms. Next slide. I also wanted to share two questions from the Center of Climate Change Communication at Yale. They put together this survey in 2019, and they've asked all sorts of questions, but I think two are really interesting here. The first at the top is they asked, how would you describe the way you feel about global warming? And the choices were alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive. And what turns out is that Latino or Latina and Black Americans were far more likely to be alarmed or concerned than whites about global warming. Similarly, when asked, how willing or unwilling would you be to join a campaign to convince elected officials to take action to reduce global warming, respondents could select from three options. The first was, I'm already participating in a campaign like this. Two, I would definitely do it. And three, I probably would do it. Again here, Latino and Latina and Black Americans are far more willing than whites to join a campaign to convince elected officials to take action on to reduce global warming. We don't know what Asians think, so shout out to Yale. That's something I think you should look into. So when I hear that Black, Indigenous, and people of color either don't know or don't care enough about climate change to take action, I think it's fair to say that the data says otherwise. And it should not be surprising at all when we see that it's these very same communities who are so close to the issues. Next slide. So a professor from the University of Michigan in 2014 assessed the state of diversity in environmental organizations. These included NGOs, foundations, and government agencies. And their findings were that BIPOC people make up 15.4% of the workforce. So this is a couple of years back, but I think these are important points. So across all of these institutions, there has been significant progress on gender diversity, but these gains have predominantly been for white women who now hold more than half more than half of these positions across all of these organizations. Women of color still sit at the margins in these places. That being said, men are still far more likely than women, or females, as I put it here, to occupy the most powerful positions in each of these organizations. And the concerning piece here is that racial diversity lags far behind gender diversity. So if we look at just one of the findings, we see that in presidential roles in conservation and preservation organizations, less than 1% of those roles are taken by all of BIPOC communities. 99.1 go to whites. So we have a serious problem here. The people who are disproportionately impacted, but also the people who are also most willing to take action, are not in the positions of power or influence over the decisions that relate to climate and to their very own lives. And I'll let you sit with that and look forward to a further discussion on how we can address these issues.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I want to thank the Building Museum, and I want to thank all the panelists before me. I'm really connected to all the things that you said, and a lot of my work connects to it, especially Tatum. You'll see. I'm in New Orleans, Louisiana right now, and I am on the land of the Homa, Chittamauga, Coushatta, Choctaw, and Tunica. And I would like to give homage and pay respect to those ancestors. I am Director of Landscape Architecture at the University of Texas in Arlington, which is DFW, between Dallas and Fort Worth. And I am also Principal Landscape Architect for Diane Jones, which has offices in New Orleans and now in DFW, but also in New Orleans. The work and my practice and my research is really centered on environmental justice, placemaking, and community building for vulnerable communities. And first slide, or next slide, thank you. So my research, I've been looking at maroons and the maroon landscape, and maroons are escaped slaves who decided not to go north on the Underground Railroad. They decided they were going to be free. They didn't want to be a part of that society, and that they were not going to be slaves. They were going to be free. And so they tended to live in landscapes in places like the Great Dismal Swamps, and people all know of the maroons in Haiti and Jamaica, but there were large maroon colonies in the United States, and especially in the Louisiana wetlands. So I'm looking at maroons, trying to look at how they lived and survived in these places, kind of as a model for coastal resiliency. And also, I'm looking at the maroons as ancestors of people, African Americans that are surviving and actually have this climate change knowledge and trying to make this connection. As they say, there's staggering wetland loss. The picture is the Bayou Bienvenue wetland triangle. And this is where Katrina did not do the real damage. It set out, there was wind damage. It set out in the Gulf. But because of the saltwater intrusion, which killed this dense cypress swamp, if you could see the old map from about 1798, it was all a cypress swamp. But then in 2019, you could see the depletion of the wetlands as development happened. So the storm surge is what kind of caused, it did cause the breaking of the flood wall. So if you go, so this is the research I'm looking at now. So if you go to the next slide. So what I'm trying to glean out of this are, these maroon tenants. So how did they survive in these places? What can we get out of how they lived? That they represented this alternative way of living. They understood, they had an understanding of the physical landscape because they lived in a place where, other people especially slave catchers and other people could not come and get them because they had a connection to the animals, the flora, the fauna. And they lived in a restorative manner as opposed to the capital means of production. And the capital enslavement means production, which is the term that Sayers uses in his book, which was a way of life, slavery was that took from the land, where Maroons tried to protect the land because protecting the land meant safety and not getting caught. So to live in harmony, almost biomimicry with the land. So, how do you take this forward? So this slide is a project that is going on now. It's a project called the NORACAP, which is the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority Community Adaptation Program. And it's how it connects to the research is that it's about the fact that the responsibility, not just the responsibility, but the knowledge to deal with climate change and the impacts of disasters should be shared and put in the hands of residents. So the blue, you could see an area that has a blue line around it, that's Gentilly. And what happened in Gentilly, it was one of the neighborhoods along the London Avenue Canal, which broke and was flooded after Katrina. So as in other places in New Orleans, a large facility was constructed to capture water. But this pilot project said, let's put it in the hands of residents. So instead of building a retention pond or on public land doing stormwater, they decided to give every resident $25,000, every resident in Gentilly who applied for it, and working with a landscape architect and a design build, it was a design build team, we would capture the water on the site, working with the residents who actually know where the water runs and to use green stormwater infrastructure. So it's kind of a way of taking that idea of putting it back into the hands of the cultural bearers and the people that live on the land. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, thank you. And the last project I'll talk about is, I'm proud to brag, to say that I was part of one of two teams that won the SOM Foundation Research Prize for 2020. And we won it for Reclaiming Black Settlements, a design playbook for historic communities in the shadow of sprawl. And long title. And so this was myself. We had a community partner, actually several community partners in Austin Allen, who's an architecture professor, and also Kate Holliday, who's an architecture professor. So it's cross-disciplinary. And basically, there were freedmen settlements, the same thing, escaping slavery, and even during slavery, many African-Americans moved west. And they settled on bottomlands or lands that were not desirable at the time. Well, so there are several of these freedmen towns along the Trinity River. And these towns are now desirable. And so they're suffering pressure from wanting to create parks in the flood zone, wanting to, development pressures, or, there, all kinds of pressures that are coming upon these towns that have been there for, decades. And so we're working with them to collaborate, to kind of put, how do you solve this problem back into their hands, to use their knowledge to deal with the pressures that they are solving, and to give them a tool to put pressure on the powers to help solve their problems. So I'm going to stop there. And again, thank you so much for having me.
Yay, I think we're all here. All right. So yeah, to start off, I wanted to ask the question just really quickly, how do we determine, or how do we define an interrelationship between climate change and social justice? I mean, from the various topics that I think we all discussed, there's definitely that connection, but how do we better connect people to between the two topics or between the two ideas. And I'll start with Joyce, but anybody can also add to this question.
Yeah, so I think the question of how to distinguish between, let's say, adaptation and greenhouse gas mitigation is really important when we talk about trying to help those who are disproportionately impacted by climate risk. Because the thing about resilience that's so incredibly important for those of us who are resilience practitioners is that it impacts people on the ground in their homes every day. And although we are all very aware that the first thing we need to do to adapt to climate change risk is to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, decrease the amount of carbon that we're emitting in the air through our energy, decrease the amount of methane that we're emitting in our air through our refrigerants. We also appreciate that when we decrease greenhouse gas emissions, we are actually not having much collateral benefit for our local communities. It's this ethereal greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. But when we build resilience, when we decrease flooding on a street that has had 10 decades of flooding, we see huge growth in the ability of that family to actually achieve wealth. I'm looking for these in my notes, and I'm sorry I didn't find them in my prepared remarks. So I just have to remind us all that today, St. James Parish, Louisiana, which I know is close to several of the people that have already given remarks today, is under a state of emergency due to rising lake levels. And this is a place that is part of the 85-mile stretch of the Mississippi River that is home to approximately 150 oil refineries and petrochemical plants. It's nicknamed Cancer Alley. So while many of us are sitting on dry land tonight, in St. James Parish, where 52% of the people who live here are people of color and 38% are below the poverty line, they have a 50% likelihood to have a 6-foot flood in the next 10 years. 50% likelihood, 6-foot flood in the next 10 years. This is devastation because in that likelihood is also the everyday inconvenience and expense of flooding that happens very frequently. So when we talk about greenhouse gas mitigation, great, get to it, make sure that you do that. It's needed now more than ever. But if we don't focus on BIPOC community members, flooding and extreme heat and wildfire risks, we have actually not served our American communities. So that's where I think the real distinction lies between our greenhouse gas mitigation and our resilience. And I'm sure some of our panelists will help us to understand where there is a nice intersection between these two areas. But for me, it's all about social equity first resilience.
I'd like to add to that. Can you hear me? So there's this really good book called Palaces for the People by Eric Klinenberg. And he centers this concept of social infrastructure. And he talked about, in particular, when disasters happen, like if you think about Hurricane Sandy in New York or Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, that when those disasters occurred, the first responders were not the government, they were not the EMS, they were neighbors, they were community. Community came out for community. And so there's this real strong connection between the ability of a community to withstand and sort of like recover from disaster and the strength of their social network, socioeconomic networks, I would say. And so he stresses the importance of, like, when you're dealing with developing or upgrading infrastructure to strengthen a community against climate change, that you also need to think about how that infrastructure can also support strengthening the social resilience of the community, so that you do have a close-knit, connected community where they know each other, where people are looking out for their grandmothers or mothers or fathers or whatever, but they're able to support each other as the real first responders when disaster strikes. And I think that really is one of the ways in which there's this really strong connection between social equity and climate resilience.
Brilliant. Anyone? Oh yeah, go ahead, Tatum.
Yeah, I'll jump in with just a bit of a story from Dallas. And I think Ifeoma already described and articulated really well the relationship between shocks and stresses, and that when you have aging infrastructure, when you have poor access to transit, a hailstorm in the case of Dallas, because that's one of our biggest shocks, that comes in and what does it do? It puts the most vulnerable populations at risk. So who are those folks? Those are the folks that don't have medical insurance, they don't have home insurance. So when we were developing the resilience strategy with community leaders and stakeholders across Dallas, and we got them to look at the shocks and stresses that impact Dallas, and we asked them, what keeps you up at night? What worries you most? The community knew that it was the underlying inequities, which eventually we developed the strategy around equitable transportation, equitable jobs, and equitable government. People knew this, and people knew it really well. And I think in Dallas, the Sun Belt is seeing a ton of growth, both in terms of jobs, population, and a lot of wealth. But when you look at the actual numbers, poverty hasn't been this bad in the last 15 years. It increased by 46%. We talked about many of the indicators throughout the presentations at the beginning, but unemployment rates, access to elementary schools, better preparation for college, all of those indicators showed that we had a city of haves and have-nots, and the have-nots were being left behind. So just to sort of really reiterate what others have said, when the underlying structures and stresses are in such a critical condition and disparities are so prevalent, a shock is just one more blow to the system. And in Dallas, that was really clear, not just to practitioners, but to everyone who has been involved in this sort of 5-year-long conversation around where should we be focusing our efforts in community resilience.
Oh, and I just wanted to add that, these things are intentional. They're not like, I got a grant to look at transit deserts in Houston, in Harris County, and we overlapped them with areas of extreme flooding. So I worked with a geoscientist, and then I mapped the transit deserts, which are areas of high demand and low access. So we mapped all the transit lines, and it turned out that, of course, the areas of flooding overlaid the areas that had the least transit. And when I say it's intentional, because, I'll just say it, the American landscape was organized by race. I mean, that redlining map was shown. So these things are, it's kind of like we say, oh, well, these things we discovered. Well, this stuff was intentional. The way the cities were laid out, the way access to transit, the way people of certain backgrounds are put in the more vulnerable areas. So I just want to say it's intentional. So the solutions have to be intentional.
I agree completely. And maybe I'll just wrap this, Dawveed, before you move on. But I think we've all noted the decade-long policies, but I think even if we take it out of the US context, it is also about poverty. So this economic disparity, it's not always racialized. But if we look at statistics, and I'm just going to rattle off a couple for the United States, and these are from NOMA, and they're also for the Center for Disease Control. So the 10 counties most vulnerable to flooding and other disasters are 81% minority in population. 87% of flood damage claims were paid in communities of color. 10 counties rated most vulnerable to extreme heat. The population is 67% minority. So, when we hear that, it actually blows back our hair. It's really hard to process what that does spiritually to a community, I would say. But I think it's really important what Ifeoma said, which it's not just about hearing these really hard to process statistics, but it's about how we can strengthen with design communities. We saw that actually with those extreme heat events that Joyce talked about in Chicago. A couple of communities were heavily impacted, and the community that had stronger church and community bonds and essentially knocked doors for the elderly had less deaths. so part of this is also how we replan our cities, but it's also how we reach out to our neighbors. And I think this is really a story of optimism and resiliency that all of us can encourage with our work.
Brilliant, brilliant. So that's a couple of more. I know we're a little behind, but I wanted to ask Ifeoma, I know you've done a lot with your work through Creative Urban Alchemy, Black Space, and Dark Matter University and that sort of thing. But I wanted to get your thoughts on how the industry can, sort of start to look at or start to understand what actions the industry, building industry should take to start to address issues of climate action and social justice.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is really a central question. And I think the tie that binds the different spaces or the different hats that I wear is really about centering the lived experience of residents, particularly if you're working in marginalized communities, really understanding how those stresses are impacting people. And without understanding those stresses and how they are impacting people and place, and really striving to address those stresses as you're thinking about guarding against those climate change shocks, then you're not really getting to the core of the challenge that's unique to communities of color, particularly communities that have been marginalized for so long. And so for me, I think, with Dark Matter University, through education in the academic sphere, we're really thinking about how we're training new architects and planners to understand this dynamic. Through the Black Space Urbanist Collective, we're really thinking about ways that design and planning is fostering the strengthening of social networks in community. And through Creative Urban Alchemy, I'm really thinking about that idea of social infrastructure, how people can be actually integrally involved in the design, in the co-design, in the co-implementation, in the co-operation and maintenance of our open spaces, those third spaces, the places where community happens, where community bonds are formed, and really thinking about how they can foster stronger social ties and stronger community. So I think, for the building industry, really thinking about how the ways in which not only your final product, but also your process can foster stronger ties in a community, and really centering those stresses, those consistent stresses that have been wearing down a community through the decades in your solutions at addressing climate resilience.
Oh, Joyce, you look like you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to also mention, in local government, which is where I tend to do a lot of my work, we have capital improvement budgets, right? And those things that go through city council by and large, and they're public. And you saw the maps that I shared, like in the city of Chicago, for instance, it shows that there's a lot more flooding that's aligned with communities that are also below the poverty line. And this is due to the fact, several things. One is that those were actually wetlands initially, and then as they were built up, the lower income houses were redlined to put in those swampier areas, but also because over time, we have not invested in our infrastructure in those neighborhoods intentionally. And so now is the time to mainstream essentially what I call reparations cost benefit analysis for our cities. And what I mean is that we can actually intentionally put our money into communities that have intentionally been left out, and worse than left out, for hundreds of years, 400 years, but even further than that for Indigenous people. And the effort it takes is to include our chief financial officers in the kinds of conversations that we're having today, helping to illustrate why there is fiscal imperative for additional funding flowing to BIPOC communities, and how by increasing funding for social infrastructure, and in that category, I include all these incredible things that SOM works on and AECOM works on, but I also include things like public health and schooling and job training. If we can flood more funding into our lower income and BIPOC communities for these assets, which many of us just take for granted that work in our communities, we will see an incredible decrease in segregation, which, if we're going to just come back to the numbers for a moment here, will give all of us a huge economic boost. And so our chief financial officer is going to look at these balance sheets, and she's going to see her capital improvement plan, and she's going to ask herself, well, where is the best benefit to doing a project? And if we have done our work well, the cost benefit calculations should say that the most impressive benefit comes to BIPOC communities. And that is not currently how these cost benefit analysis work. So we have many people on this panel, many members of the Building Museum who likely use our traditional cost benefit analysis. And I really encourage you to take an afternoon to pick it apart and see how your capital improvement plan would look different if you actually used a reparations cost benefit analysis, a cost benefit analysis that targeted resources towards BIPOC communities.
Brilliant,
I'm
brilliant.
just going to
Yes.
say, challenge accepted, Joyce. Wonderful. We, I think that is really, and we were just talking about this with the client today, the social cost of carbon. So layering that into the cost benefit analysis, and one of the, I think, impacts that you talked about strongly, and I've talked about with my students in real estate, is that we don't have a financial model that supports this transformative design that we all want to see. And so getting smart about the finance is absolutely critical, making it a win-win. I think, just like the word defund, the word reparation raises the hair on the back of people's necks. I don't think within this audience, but to me, it's creating that win-win. And right now, life cycle analysis externalizes so much about the environment and about community that it's less than a useful tool. So I think that's really a wonderful and important comment.
Brilliant, brilliant. So one question, I'll maybe do one more, and then we'll do some Q&A because we actually have a couple of questions coming up. But Tatum, I wanted to really ask you a question about, sort of talking to the importance of inclusive and transparent engagement as part of all of these processes and to address climate impacts. So I'll hand it over to get some of your thoughts on that, and others feel free to jump in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to repeat anything, and I think Diane and Ifeoma very eloquently talked about some of the methods that they've been using with communities they're engaging with. But I think I also want to sort of approach this question in two ways. And the first is really when we think about the term engagement from the perspective of like a traditional practitioner, urban planner, or architect. It's a question that hasn't really been answered very well for over 30 years. What is the spectrum that also includes placation and manipulation, that also includes citizen ownership? Where do we fit on that, and what is our role? As in some ways, as practitioners in the planning and design world, how does that fit with models of citizen ownership and control? And there are a lot of contradictions there. So purely from a sort of pragmatic approach that takes into account budgets and time, I think there are still really good principles, excuse me, that we can think about. And as I said, Ifeoma already talked about many of them, but it's really understanding the concerns of people. And, we may talk about passengers and vehicles that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, but really, how do we frame that as, how do you get to work? Or what other options are there for you? What is stopping you from taking some of those options? So really learning to speak a different language, and I don't mean language literally, but how do we reframe our perspectives and think about other cultures when we ask questions like, what concerns you most? And then the other thing is really understanding what solutions are important to people and how they can be designed to address these inequities. But in order to do this, it's not so much catching up with them so much as integrating the communities you're working with. So Diane already talked about partnerships with communities and developing, using our expertise, because we don't expect everyone to go through a 4-year planning and architecture degree to be able to come up with the tools. I think our role as facilitators is to bring to the table some of those things that work and then co-create the methods that are really relevant to individual communities. But really, just to zoom out, I think we shouldn't be thinking about engagement through the lens of how do we practice with our clients and stakeholders. I think we should, I hope that the takeaway from my 3 slides earlier on was really we need to be looking at our entire systems, and our systems include our institutions and the practices in which we work. So who are those people? Who are our coworkers? Who is leadership? Who are the people we elect? Because they make decisions about us or for us. So really, we shouldn't, in order to understand communities' concerns and use the appropriate language for co-solutioning, we should be partnering with these people, but also those people who have the ideas and who are close to the issues should be at the table.
Yes, well said, well said. Anyone want to add to that before we?
I just want to agree and say, engagement has to be transactive, right? So, everybody's coming and, like as Tatum was saying, co-partners on the solution. And I just want to say that we have failed because I've done kind of like a study of engagement, over the years. And what we seek is buy-in. We go to communities to get buy-in, right? Client, there's a solution, there's already a program, and you want buy-in from the community. And I think we shouldn't seek buy-in, right? Because, we should start with, so what is it that we're trying to buy into? That should come from this transactive engagement. But often what happens, where, the program, the RFP comes out, the program, even in these kind of projects, it's already kind of set, and what you're seeking is buy-in as opposed to, a transactive partnership to maybe decide, because often, what is you're trying to get them to buy into might not be the right solution. And often it isn't, because the neighborhood floods again, or gets torn down, or, the answer isn't, solved. The problems aren't solved because we were getting buy-in. So I do think, we just have to kind of start over, because the history of engagement, especially for communities of in this, and this is my humble opinion, has been a failure. Rethink how we're doing this. Yeah. And it takes all those things, you're right. It takes developers and, and cities and, the funding and all that stuff. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, we just go and make, it's not easy. But trying to solve it to do it the right way is worth it.
Yes, completely agree. You see so often that folks are tired of engagement because they've only been engaging authentically. So they're like, why should I do this? Why should I waste my time while I got kids to feed and bills to pay and all of that stuff? So it really has to be an added value to them, that they have to see value and that they have to see their outcomes being part of that whole process. Completely agree with all of that, Tatum and Diane. So I want to switch a little bit to some of the audience questions, and we have kind of a first one which may be a little fun. I think Kevin asks, this is more to Diane, was the area occupied by the Maroon people the same area in the movie Beasts of the Southern Wild? And if you have seen it.
Yes, and I love that movie. I love that movie. Actually, there were settlements, you're right, all through Louisiana and Louisiana wetlands. The settlement that I'm looking at, Bas de Fleuve, which is the picture in back of me, is more between Lake Borgne and the Gulf and New Orleans. But in Mines and those other parishes, there were Maroon communities, and it's because there were Indians, homeless. There were these kind of they kind of did this kind of transaction with each other, right? The Indians, the Native Americans taught Maroons, and Maroons taught, because they brought things from Africa, So they kind of formed these communities all through the Louisiana swamps. So there were Maroons in that community, even though, like I said, there were several. And the community that I'm looking at is like I said, closer Bayou Bienvenue, which is between Lake Borgne and New Orleans. So yes. And I love them.
So one additional question, it's what are the biggest challenges that prevent global design firms from leveraging their economic influence to change the type of ways and ways of that development occurs? Sorry, that was a little jumbled. Let's see, global design firms leveraging their economic influence to change the type of and ways that development occurs. I don't know, Arathi or Tatum, I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
I mean, I think I might jump in, Tatum, because the question from Ryan is really a good one. And I think it is this question of all of us. So one thing that we talk about a lot at SOM is we have 50% repeat clients. And so I think the conversation that you have with the client the first time you meet them, and this also goes back to what Diane was saying, how do you make it not transactional? It's quite different than a client that you work with for many, many years. And I think we are seeing that too, that, you know, the question goes on to talk about people, some of our peers like Zaha Hadid withdrawing from Architects Declare because they feel that it goes too far, you know, relating this as an emergency and they can't continue to do their work and meet the goals of this. Or maybe they feel that they're being false. SOM does do similar work, and we've talked about the ethics of this in our climate action group. I think we feel very strongly that we have to do something. This is kind of our joking hashtag. As we can see in this conversation, it's imperfect, and every day we're learning. And I think we have to come with that spirit. These kinds of big infrastructural projects that SOM and AECOM works on will continue. And how do we bring this spirit of participation? There's also an opportunity in these projects. They're at the scale of a city. And we can talk, and we do talk about floodplain risks and other aspects that perhaps other practices aren't as privileged to work on. So with that comes a lot of responsibility. I think we would be the first to admit we're still learning. And so part of our responsibility is trying to invite as many people to the table that can help us make better decisions for the communities we work in. We're not perfect, but we're trying to be better. I think it's the takeaway from all of us, right? We all have work to do.
Yeah, and I think it is, you know, sort of there, you know, the firm isn't always the same as the people, you know, so it's, and the folks, you know, who are, you know, like us, who are on this call, work at SOM and AECOM, you know, sort of big international firms, you know, are still, you know, sort of very passionate in our own right about the projects that we want to do, and working in communities and taking the time to really, you know, as Arathi mentioned, really learn more and sort of bring that to these, you know, sort of larger scale projects that, you know, need voices to talk about equity, need voices to bring other things to the table and to show that value works in a lot of different ways, and that it's not just an economic, you know, sort of equation, that there are a lot of other pieces to the puzzle. And I could say from when I started at, you know, sort of SOM 10 or 12 years ago till now, there's definitely a bigger and a much more, I think, vigorous response from you know, the development community, from you know, sort of local Black and Brown developers. Like we're working with one now on a project in Inglewood in Chicago, where we, you know, it's SOM, but then we're working with a local, you know, kind of small scale developer on a community led and focused project where we're about to get into sort of engagement now, but really focusing around food and health and wellness and building on some work that had already been done. But it's interesting to, you know, sort of get to scale up and down and bring some of the things that you learned from those big mega projects down to the community level, and bring some of the things you learned from the community up to those big mega projects. And we saw some amazing results, sort of on our projects. And we're continuing to learn and continuing to grow in all of that.
Yeah, in addition to thinking about partnering with communities, and I don't know if this question was specifically phrased around sort of sprawling, single family development in terms of building. And I guess for AICOM anyway, and for the planning and urbanism team, we're mostly serving public sector clients. And what we're seeing, and we're mostly in the business of infrastructure. So what we're really seeing is that our clients, local and regional and federal governments, have a much higher expectation for us to integrate these things. So our approach to this is we want to take on these challenges as planners, or as, we're an integrated group, but we have thousands and thousands of engineers who build highways and pipelines and giant infrastructure projects. So I think the challenge, and it's a welcome challenge, and it's what we do in our everyday practice, is collaborate across all of these disciplines to make sure when decisions are being made about where highways go, whether they expand or not, what are the indicators that should, I think Joyce already talked about this, what are the cost benefits, what are the costs and benefits, and how do you take into account co-benefits when you make a decision about where are we spending our federal dollars or public dollars, and who that's going to impact. So we're definitely hearing from our clients that these are things we need to think about, and we're pushing all of our teams to think about it holistically. So we don't actually have the same dilemma with, I don't work with private sector developers that much and have to grapple with that question, thankfully.
I'm actually really glad that Tatum mentioned existing infrastructure and just like engineers and just the need for this cross-disciplinary approaches to problem solving, to urban problem solving as it relates to climate resilience. Because, that slide where I showed stresses and shocks, if you looked at the stresses and hardships, much of those stresses and hardships are as a result of existing infrastructure. If you think about the 50s and 60s when the Federal Highway Act was put into place and highways were built throughout the country, and they tore through communities of color, and with them they brought air pollution and division, economic division, and all other, and then the symptoms, the other symptoms such as food insecurity and gentrification, crime and violence, poverty. You can tie them. You can tie all those issues, those hardships and stressors. You can actually connect them to the construction of all of these federal highways that were built throughout the country. And those red line maps that I also showed, they became the blueprint for where those highways would go through. So those red line communities that were Black and brown communities, low-income communities, those became the places where highways were tore through. And so there's this grappling with existing infrastructure and the impact that they have had when we're thinking about new infrastructure as well. And so I think there's just an importance of understanding that layered history, grappling with that, serving to resolve that as we're thinking about new infrastructure to address these new challenges that we're seeing arising today.
So one last question, or there's I think two more questions, and then we can kind of give some final comments. But one question from Kevin: if solutions must be intentional, which I agree with, how does the nation/community get around get the civil rights laws that we fought for over the last 60+ years, calling for equal treatment?
I saw that question, and that's kind of like the direction I was heading in with, talking about existing infrastructure, because what I was trying, I think the point that I was trying to connect to that question is that the ways in which land has been developed has not been equal.
Yes.
And so equity is really thinking about that in inequality in spaces and places, and really thinking about how you can address that inequality in spaces and places, and bringing the resources and development needs to communities that have been marginalized for so long. So you can actually achieve that level of equal treatment. But right now, we're not at that level of equal treatment. So all that was fought for during the civil rights movement, which was really ignited by inequalities in housing. All of that was fought for. We haven't arrived at that place yet when we're thinking about, you know, wealthy, affluent white communities and Black communities of color. So I think, you know, just a lot of this work, you know, thinking about climate resilience and the development of new infrastructure, that you can address this intersectionality. And environmental justice is really at that intersectionality where you're thinking about how can you arrive at equity in those communities that have been held back for so long, while you're also addressing, you know, fortifying the community against the shocks of climate change.
I want to say that, you know, right now I feel there's a great opportunity to do just, you know, what Ifeoma was speaking about, because of the fact that, you know, if this infrastructure bill comes and we, you know, have to address the worn out bridges and freeways which pass through, so those places are going to have to be redeveloped, and, you know, how do you approach it equitably? And I think, so that opportunity is there. But I think also that what we have to do, which I think is very hard, but what we have to do is realize that the health and welfare of these communities really is totally connected to the health and welfare of the whole country. You know, we tend to separate it, right? Like, you know, but really, if, you know, these communities are doing better, having equal access, you know, not having environmental issues, then the whole country, other people that are not, quote, BIPOC would also benefit from this. But there's been this trick, even though in front of our eyes, we can see that, you know, the costs go up for everybody. The, you know, the impacts actually impact everyone, but we do this trick to say, oh, it's like them, right? We, you know, so I think the thing is to somehow to show the benefit that it will have to, you know, the whole country, if that's what we want, right? If we want a democracy, and I think that's, I mean, not to get political, that we're facing now is, do we want that, you know? And I think once we decide we want that, then solving these problems, you know, that these communities face will be, you know, something which will be focused on, and then the whole country will, everyone else will benefit from it.
I agree completely with this. And I think the opportunity, if we want to frame it apolitically, is the original New Deal that Roosevelt brokered really raised a generation of capital, you know, for poor white Americans. And so the New Deal is really looking at that for BIPOC communities. It was heavily influenced by the Youth Sunrise movement, which is an incredible movement. If some of you don't know about them, look them up. Kids are changing the world. And it's looking at the Youth Climate Core. So in the same way that we can say, let's raise people economically, and I would be the first to label it as BIPOC. And of course, you know, you don't have to label it like that, Diane. As you're saying, it's like we have to decide. And for some people, that's going to put their back up. Fine, let's call it the Youth Climate Core, because this will benefit everyone. In Illinois, and I know Joyce has also been working on this, there's the Clean Energy Jobs Act, and it's the first in the nation. It's going up for vote shortly. And again, it is kind of a large portion of the bill is looking at disenfranchised communities and having incubation startup capital for businesses all to get into solar and wind. And I think, again, this is a way to have economic improvements without saying bluntly that's what we're doing, but we build the infrastructure in the communities that need it. And so it's almost like a political framing, but at the end of the day, it's a win-win. And I think really for those of us who are all here and everyone is so interested in the work and trying to do everything they can, it's incredibly important to find that and, you know, help us sustain basically everything that we want to see.
Brilliant, brilliant. So I have one last question to wrap, and then we'll kind of kick it over to our gracious sponsors. But what would you say the biggest resilience issue? What would you say is the biggest resistance to this issue that you encounter, or the most common response?
I could start and say that I think that for many people who are white privileged, like myself, the idea that there is white supremacy and that there is white privilege is a shock. But all we have to do is look around. And it's very obvious that there is, in fact, white privilege. And so when we realize that by looking in the mirror, looking at ourselves and seeing what role we have played in the perpetual inequality and inequity in America, I think it becomes clear that white America needs to be very proactive in solving for climate resilience injustice, for environmental injustice, and for social inequities. So I think the biggest resistance is that many white leaders presume that that is the work of BIPOC leaders. But I believe that BIPOC leaders can, just like white leaders have always done, choose whatever they want to do. Maybe they do want to work in this space, but maybe they prefer to be lawyers for corporate America or something else altogether, you know, a doctor for this, or run a hair salon, or whatever they want to do. So it's up to us, those of us who've already experienced so much privilege, to step into the space of courage around the word reparations and white supremacy and find pathways to the sort of working at the speed of trust. Ifeoma, thank you for that. That is one of the big takeaways for me on this. The transactional pieces that Diane mentioned, for me, it's like we have the opportunity to build trust, but we also can break it so much faster than we can build it. So, you know, I really invite anyone on the phone who is in the same demography as I to ask the question, what role have I played today in breaking down inequity? That's the thing that I think we need to do.
I think that, and I'll just put it out here, I think one of the things that holds us back from doing this thing is because these solutions and addressing this is thought of as like affirmative action. And what I mean by that, if you look at the imagery, like the imagery of Katrina, the imagery of after any disaster, it's usually Black people or, you know, poor low income people that you see, that the media puts out there. I mean, in Hurricane Harvey, there were many people that were not of color that suffered from that, right? Of course, they have better insurance, they have all kinds of things and they can get out of it. But I think, unfortunately, dealing with this is thought of like affirmative action. Like, why are we giving this to them? You know, we should be doing something else with this money, you know, even though these things eventually, you know, the climate change is going to impact everyone. But because of the media spin and the imagery people see, it's easier to say, oh, it's for them. So then people, just like they don't want affirmative action, they feel we shouldn't be addressing flooding and fires and all these things that are impacting people of color that for certain reasons, as we all talked about today, are in those spaces. So I think that's one of the things that's holding us back.
I also think that, I mean, the work is hard. It's hard to change systems. System change is hard. And so there's a lot of inertia and thinking about how people can engage. And the one thing I've learned from being, you know, almost 20 years in sustainability is to really surround your people who can also carry water. You know, just, you can't carry the load all the time. And as Joyce wonderfully articulated, sometimes people just don't want to carry the load. But I think what is optimistic in all of this, despite, you know, everything that's been difficult and leading up to this and the last 2 years of peaceful protests, both on climate and justice. And I think they have been transformative. They brought kitchen table dialogue to the country that was really, really strongly needed. Some of it more aggressive than others, but at least people are talking about these critical issues. And I'll just end with saying that, you know, inertia is really our enemy in this. And so it's how do we chip away at it every day? How do we invite more intelligent people to dialogue with us and recognize we don't have perfect solutions to this? That's the only way we're going to change what we want to see.
All right, you guys, I think we have to get in the curtain call, so we have to wrap it up. But really appreciate having all of you here, and I'll pass it to Eileen to wrap us up.
Thank you, Dawveed, Ifeoma, Joyce, Arathi, Diane, and Tatum for this just thought-provoking, important program. I have so many takeaways from this. I really connected with this idea of intentionally prioritizing social resiliency through infrastructure projects and so much more. This was so great. Thank you so much. For our audience, this discussion is being recorded and it will be available as an edited version on our website. And please join us next Thursday, June 3rd, for our next program, Green Innovation as Savior, Rethinking Technology. Thank you so much for joining us. Good night.